lazy, so I'm going to involve you lots. What's the worst introduced grass in Australia? Wheat!
Oh, geez.
I mean, all of our best soils and plasters and everything in southern Australia is being cleared to grow this bloody weedy thing called wheat. And if you go and look at Queensland, what used to be the most important rainforest, there's plenty of rainforest in Queensland. I know the botanist there, and he says, look, we've got rainforest on the hills, you know, run out of our ears, and in fact, it's taken over country we don't want it to take over. But the fertile soils that had the most important rainforest have all been cleared to grow bloody another grass, sugarcane. And then you look at rice in the, you know, the nice wetlands, sorghum, barley, blah, blah, blah. And what about Central Australia? I've just been talking about non-arid Australia. I reckon the worst weed in Central Australia is a native, the spinifex. Because it's the dominant grass, well, it's the dominant grass in Australia, really. And what's it good for? Having lots of wildfires. And a few bilbies which are just about extinct. So I mean, this is a story. What is a weed? Well, and how come we are so prone, if you forget the things we're actually planting to support our bodies, I've often stood on the cliffs on southeastern Kangaroo Island, looking down on the Southern Ocean with great big waves crashing up against the rocks, and seals swimming around and sharks and whatnot. Thinking, now if I was here 20,000 years ago, I would be looking at the most fertile, most human-occupied part of southern Australia, the Murray River Delta, that would have been there. You would have seen the Murray. Apparently, for some reason, the Murray River didn't reduce its flow during the ice ages, so I'm told. So that would have been a beautiful, fertile delta with heaps of animals and people living on what is now under the roaring Southern Ocean. And if I stood on a hill in New Guinea, looking towards Australia, all I would have seen between me and Australia was this beautiful big freshwater lake being fed by all the rivers running off the hills in New Guinea and the ones from Australia as well. And we were joined up, of course. Between us and Tasmania was another beautiful freshwater lake, because we were joined up to Tasmania as well. So really, not many of us think, most of us, sorry, think that what we're seeing now around us is what Australia's been like forever, or for a long time. We're living in an atypical period of Australia's climate over the last 2.5 million years. The last 2 million years at least, Australia has mostly been the way I described it, with these big freshwater lakes, and this part of the world being quite arid, but a lot cooler, and possibly not that much drier because you'd have much less evaporation. We don't really know. We don't really know what was happening here. But we do know that for most of the time, the last 2 million years, the climate was very, very different here, and we were a long way from, much further from the sea, especially if you're heading up towards Darwin. Darwin was just sitting on this cliff overlooking the land that stretched on all the way to the top end of New Guinea. And what animals were occupying at least before 50,000 years ago, and 50,000 years isn't long considering we're talking about 2 million years at least. Years ago I went to ANU, the prehistory department, and we sat there and the smoker, it was quite an interesting smoker because in those days, you know, you didn't swear in front of girls. But there was quite a few women in the smoker room, and they were rampant feminists, and they were swearing much worse than us blokes. It was quite an eye-opener for me. I said to them, I said, look, you're prehistorians, what the hell's going on? I'm living in arid Australia, and there was all this grass here before we came, and no animals using it to speak of, except a few little kangaroos. There weren't many kangaroos around. Kangaroos have increased incredibly in a lot of Australia once we got water and less dingo, blah, blah, blah. So what's all this grass doing here? Why didn't we have animals like Africa's got? And this woman said to me, look, I've been studying this sinkhole in southern Australia, where animals keep falling in regular intervals. And she said, right down the bottom, all the animals that fell in were browsers. Well, 95% of them. And then suddenly, around about 40, 50,000 years ago, the browsers disappeared and the grazers, a few grazers, a few wombats and a few kangaroos dominated, the browsers all disappeared. She said, there wasn't any bloody grass around. There couldn't have been. If the place was dominated by grazers, browsers, you know, evolution would have given us the equivalent of some of the grazers that you see in Africa. Nowhere near as many because we've got much less fertile soil. So, not only is poor old Alice Springs been through incredible climate changes because, as I said, most of the time it wasn't like this. We're living in a period, interglacial period, which was probably only around for about, no one can answer this yet because we haven't got the detail, as little as a fifth of the time. So we're actually living in an atypical period of what's happened on this continent in the last 2 million years. And way back, you would have looked around and you would have seen, if anyone's interested, this is a very good book. I don't agree with him about fire, but he summarises it very well. You would have seen this kangaroo that reached up this high to pull branches down to browse the leaves, right? Snub-nosed thing. There was a couple other kangaroos, they're all in here. There was even a little kangaroo that liked eating birds. It was incredible. Lake Eyre was permanent with flamingos. So we're living in a very unusual period right now. And I reckon that's why we are so susceptible, cats, foxes, buffel grass and couch grass, to take over, because before that they wouldn't have had a chance. There would have been too many shrubs and trees and stuff around, and grasses, in my opinion, would have been more or less restricted to the tops of the hills, spinifex up the tops of the hills where lightning strikes it all the time. And lots of grasses in the rivers where you get disturbance, where you get the rivers, because grasses are tough. But most of it would have been scrub. And what's happening in parts of New South Wales, for example, where they've overgrazed the place, so there's no grass left to burn, they're talking about the woody weeds taking over. And we're going back, because of the lack of fire, to what was probably predominantly around in at least semi-arid Australia. Simpson Desert, possibly not the driest. And what sort of made me interested in this was when Rachel Partridge got the job of helping to monitor camel effects in arid Australia, right? Now, the two Germans out on New Haven had studied camels for years and years and years. Their camels were in a little paddock. Pastors say camels don't take notice of fences. Well, that's bullshit, because they initially had these camels they were studying in a very small paddock, and they realised that they were increasing in numbers. So they opened the fence to let them into a bit of paddock, and the camels would not go over where the fence had been. In fact, they ended up dragging one over with a Toyota to try and get the others to follow, and as soon as they let it go, it went straight back and stayed on the other side of where the fence used to be. But eventually they did go into the bit of paddock. But even then, they were overstocking the place. And so it looked like camels were having a... And they were. Like, the buckbush, the common old roly-poly, you could not find one plant in this paddock, because they love buckbush. It's probably their favourite type, or one of their favourites. And they got rid of yalla, the bush potato, the yam. And so we thought camels are having a bad effect. I've seen them actually, there's the bush bean, the rincarina, that was climbing up Melaleuca, and the camels had actually carefully broken off the leaves of the Melaleuca, and were just getting one little nibble of this poor little vine that was climbing up. They're very smart. They can, they're full and stuff. So we went out expecting to find camels devastating our landscape, because there's a million out there, right? And we could not find any real serious deleterious effect of camels on the vegetation at the present numbers. The only plants, there's 3 plants that are getting rid of, right? Quandong, Pittosporum, the native apricot, and Acacia saliceps, which very few of you would know because it's pretty rare, but they love that for some reason. It often grows around near salt lakes. I've got a few on my block out of town, but there's 4, they're scattered. Those 3 plants, they are really giving a hard time. But you look at the quandong. The quandong has 6 other enemies. Number 1 is fire. Number 2 is rabbits that bring back the young ones. Number 3 is mistletoe that really get into the ones that the camels can't reach anymore. That wouldn't have happened in the past because we had possums that love mistletoe. They would have kept the mistletoe down. Number 4 is the fact there's no emus around to speak of now to spread the seeds around. You can go under a quandong tree and it's just heap of seeds underneath and none away from the tree. In the past, the emus would have spread them all over the place. Number 5 is Aborigines. I was driving down the road between Wataka, the road that goes up from the Lassiter Highway up to Wataka, the Bitumen Road. When they first put that in, I drove along there and there was quandongs everywhere. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. 15 years later, we had a ranger training course there. I think we counted 10 quandongs. And I asked the TO, I said, what happened to all the quandong trees on that? And he said, oh, then we went and dig them all up to make artefacts, because it's the roots part of it is especially good to make, it's the right soft kind of wood, blah, 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 to make artefacts out of them, and they want the roots as well as the trunk. But there's another one I've forgotten, but the most important one, which I only found out recently, was that there used to be, the quandong, by the way, if you don't know, is just behind that gentleman there, that red fruit, sticking up there, yeah. There used to be a brush-tailed bettong around here, exactly, almost identical distribution to where the quandongs used to be. And in Western Australia, they've got another quandong down there, but the same bettong. It's just a few left. And they found that wherever this bettong is, there's a lot more seedings of their quandong. Because the burrowing bettong, these brush-tailed bettongs, grab the seeds and go and bury them, because they don't eat the fruit, they eat the seeds. So they go and bury them for the bad times, and then of course they forget some of them won't. So we lost the burrowing bettong, which was probably the most important animal to ensure lots of quandongs in the place. Now poor old camel comes along and he gets the blame. Now, and my guess is it's very interesting that the case of Victoria, you all know, the prickly wattle. Now, around my part of the world, only half of them are prickly. Most of them aren't prickly unless they're very young. Only half of them, when they're young, are prickly. And then they grow up as tall as the ceiling and lose all the prickles. In that paddock on Newhaven, the camels exterminated the ones that didn't produce any prickles. And all the bushes on Newhaven, and anywhere now where there's lots of camels, are rounded things like this, about this big, with thorns sticking out everywhere, and the flowers and fruit sitting behind this carpet of thorns. So the camels have brought back the genes, got rid of the ones that lost the genes, and brought back this plant into what it usually has been for most of its history, when there was heaps of browsers around. Now my guess is that the quandong, Pittosporum and the case of Celiceps was, unlike Victoria, which still kept some of the genes, they've lost all theirs, and therefore they... I mean, if you look around, you look at ironwood, this thing growing above us here. The juveniles are tiny little leaves, lots of twigs, and the leaves are bitter. You can taste them, they're bitter. Once the leaves get up, you notice a difference, a huge difference between a juvenile ironwood. A lot of people can't recognise a juvenile. When they're trees, they have these beautiful willow-like leaves dangling down. You taste them, they're not at all bitter. Now, cows and camels will reach up and for one leaf of the non-bitter, and they leave the juveniles alone. And Capparis umbinata, Capparis, 5 species, all the same. The juveniles are thorny as buggery. The Aborigines used to use the juvenile of the wild orange, Capparis machilii, to catch bats with as they're flying out of the caves because they're so prickly. And yet you go to above this level, there's not one prickle up there. So our bloody plants are adapted to browsers. obvious why Rachel and I went out there and found camels having very little effect. Different story when you look at the cattle country. And it just brings back to me that our plants aren't adapted to cows and rabbits and buffalo and whatever, donkeys, horses, blah, blah, blah. They're adapted to browsers. And the only other tree than those three I told you about that I've seen killed by camels is the common mulga, which is now called aptenura, by the way. It's no longer acacia annuura, it's aptenura. It's the fastest growing, what I call the weedy fireweed species. And I reckon it's just new on the scene. We're having a hellish trouble trying to sort out the different mulgas because they are in the process of evolving in front of our eyes, I'm quite convinced. And it's probably to do with the fact this one I'm talking about, aptenura, is a bloody fireweed. It'll, fire will eventually get rid of it, but it's by far the most adapted to fire. It might be a new bloke on the scene, and it's not adapted to browsing, but camels only kill it when there's absolutely nothing else to eat. But there's other mulgas. I've been up a hill down this edge of the Simpson. There's two different mulga types up there, and the camels are chewing the hell out of one species and totally ignoring the other one. So this book tells you a hell of a lot about what Australia was really all about, has been all about until the last 50,000 years. And I mean, we're not just talking about this one big kangaroo that could reach this high. That's the animal that camels replacing. Exactly equivalent. A browser who can reach up higher than a cow and would have been not that common because it would have had to drink just like the camel. And that's the advantage of the camel too. The lady who's studying the camels, there was a spring, there's a spring south of Uluru up against a steep hill where the camels can't get up. So the camels have only, they can only graze on one side of the hill. And she put a depth instrument in there that can tell when people are drinking this little spring dry, right? And she could tell when the camels were coming in to drink, 2 days before it rained, the camels left. How they knew, but that's the big advantage of camels is that the minute they can get away from permanent water that they're tethered to, they're away and spell the country. That would have been the same with this big kangaroo. They would have flogged the hell out of permanent waters, but most of the country, a lot of the country would have been very lightly browsed. So Australia, was a very different place. And, in my opinion, that's one of the reasons why we now have most of them. You could say that all of the fertile soil, buffel grass is totally restricted to, and couch is restricted to the fertile soils, where there's high phosphorus earth, wouldn't you, mate?
No, not anymore. It's worse than that.
Sorry. When I say totally restricted, it is grows the most prolifically and the most dense where you've got enough good fertile soils. You won't find it in any of the red soils except under desert oaks, right? So that means 3/5 of Central Australia is sand or red earth, and mulga is only along the roads and under the desert oaks and a few others, watercourses, blah, blah, blah. So you could say half of Central Australia is never going to get, No, I won't say that, because buffle, as we know, is very good at fiddling around with its genes, isn't it? We had an expert telling us this. So, at the present time, we hope at least 1/2 of Central Australia is free of buffle and perch. And we hope will forever be, but who knows. Of course, it wasn't helped. I found this publication, December 1980. I won't mention the names. CSIRO Division of Land Resources Management, the screening of selected pasture species for the floodplains of Central Australia. And in here we proudly say that we've got Central ciliaris doing very well. We have Dicanthus annulatum, which is a very serious weed that nothing eats. Eragostus cylindricarpa was called curvulus then. Proudly established in Central Australia. As I said, I think the spinifex is our worst grass, the weed. Now I said that, all right, we need wheat if we're going to live here. Or is it the same with arid Australia? Look, we've got this wonderful animal that's come along. When we got the railway line in and the private Afghans no longer had a job, we pushed the camel saying, oh, they'll die out in the desert, you know, poor babies, but, you know, and of course they didn't. So we now got this animal out there where there's no buffalo coochie ever going to be, doing very well, frankly, on the most infertile soils in Australia, producing beautiful, healthy beef. And what do? We shoot it and let it rot. But the rest of the fertile soils, we're rapidly changing to being dominated by non-native grasses. Is that any different to us growing wheat on our fertile soils? You know, the pastoralists reckon it's the best thing since sliced bread, and there's no doubt about it. At least when you've got both native and buffalo, you're way ahead. The trouble is, once buffalo takes over, it's a different story. The little pony next door to me on my block is now dying from having nothing else to eat with buffalo. Poor bugger, I feel sorry for him. He's fat. And the interesting thing is, 1970, when I first came here, up until 1974, I remember Des Nelson and I talking about it and saying, God, we're lucky. We've hardly got a single weed in Central Australia. You know, our soils are so infertile, we won't have to worry about weeds. We were right until 1974 came along. And just of interest, I'll pass this around. I've been looking at Simpson's Gap since it was declared a park in 1971. I've been taking photos of the buffalo takeover. I've written a paper about it. But until you actually see the changes that have occurred, this is only in one spot. If you just want to look, you can see here there's hardly a bush. That's looking at where now the visitor centre is when you drive in. You drive in here to the visitor centre. And it was pretty well buggered. That's what it looks like now. You can't see all the buffalo grass behind it because the shrubs are so nice. So you might want to have a look at that, pass it around. So I've watched buffalo and